Hello. Hi to everyone who has joined or will join. I'm live today, probably about an hour. If you don't catch the live, I will download it and upload it to my YouTube channel. So if you don't have the ability to make it live today, you can still watch the recording on YouTube later. I do have a YouTube channel. It's Autumn Farms. Pretty simple. Very similar to my TikTok name. I like to try to keep things simple. So I have a few things that I plan to talk about today. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I will gladly answer any questions that you have about gardening, chicken keeping, urban homesteading. I do vermicomposting. I have a black soldier fly farm, so I can answer some questions about that. I don't consider myself an expert in anything, so I may or may not be able to answer your question, but I will do my best. And if I don't have an answer, I'll just let you know. I don't know the answer to that question. So the first things that I planned to talk about today was just around some myths. There are a lot of myths about chicken keeping, about gardening, about composting. And I think where people sometimes get a little overwhelmed is that there is a lot of information. There are a lot of different ways to do things. And sometimes it can feel like everyone is telling you that you have to do it their way or you're doing it wrong. And I just wanted to say that is not true. If you are doing something and you're getting something out of it, if you're gardening and you're growing something, if you're composting and things are breaking down, you're doing it right. You're doing it fine. There may be a better way to do it. There may not. You might learn things along the way that help you to do things in a way that's more efficient. If you're getting something out of whatever you're doing it right. So the first myth that I wanted to talk about was around composting. A lot of people have heard that you really need to get one of those really cool tumblers and that's the best way to go about it. And I think that is a good way to do it. It's also a very pricey way to do it unless you can find one of those that someone is no longer using. Because as it turned out, they didn't really find it all that efficient. Like anything, those tumblers, those devices that you load food and other things into, and then they have a crank, you crank it and turn it. Very cool design, but they're a tool, and if they're not used properly, or the environment that you live in is too hot or too cold or something, it may not work for you. I personally am unwilling to put that much money into composting because there's some much more budget-friendly ways to go about it that are very simple, that are just more budget-friendly. To me, that's the main selling point of some of the other methods that I use. It's just more budget-friendly. So you don't have to mix or turn or churn your compost like those devices are really good at doing. The main way that I compost and the way that I really got started with composting was I make what's called a compost ring. And it's just a circular piece of like fencing. So I've used chicken wire to make a ring out of, and I have used hardware cloth to make a ring out of. You basically just take your piece of chicken wire, form it into a circle, and then close the end with something. You can use zip ties. It's very easy. So you just have a circle, you place it on the ground, and then you load your material into that. And that's it. You don't have to turn it over. Turning over your compost pile is a really good way to get compost to decompose and to be usable in your garden quickly. You can turn over your compost in about 30 days. I believe it's called the Berkeley method because it was developed at UC Berkeley. And essentially it's like every 2 days you use a pitchfork to take from the top of the pile, make that the bottom of the pile. You're literally turning it over. You're taking what's on top, putting it on the bottom. At the end, what you have on the bottom will be on the top. So you just turn your pile over. You keep it covered with a tarp or another piece of plastic. You make sure that it's damp but not soaking wet. And it will give you usable compost in about 30 days, which is a really great quick turnover. It's a good way to take resources that would have otherwise just been garbage to you, not usable to you, and turn it into something that is a resource. But you don't have to do that. If you just pile up your compost and leave it in the open air, it will break down and it will be usable to you. It'll just take longer. So the other benefit of the method where it's called hot composting, the method I described where you turn over your pile and you keep it covered, you generally turn it over every 2 days, is that it's hot composting, so it's going to kill more of the seeds and other things that you don't want to sprout in your garden beds or whatever you're using your compost for. But it's not an absolute requirement, and if you just don't want to put that much effort into it, don't have the time, don't have the physical strength to use a pitchfork to turn it over, just piling it up and leaving it will also work. I have a few compost rings around my property in various locations. I don't turn them over. It's more effort than I want to put into it. I'm okay with just waiting longer because it's no work on my part other than putting it in the pile, which, I was going to put it somewhere anyway. So rather than putting it into my compost bin to be taken away by the city or the county or whatever, wherever you live, whoever collects it, I just pile it up and let it sit and let it turn into something that is useful to me. So yeah, there are lots of ways to compost, and whatever method you feel is most useful to you, that's the one that you should use. There's also vermicomposting, which is basically composting with worms. And I really like composting with worms. I use the red wiggler worms that I bought them online. You don't have to. You can definitely just use earthworms that are present in the ground where you live. That's also perfectly acceptable. And if you just have a compost ring sitting on the ground, that, like I described earlier, that's what will happen. The earthworms will find their way in there and they'll help to break the material down. But if you want something that's a little bit more efficient, the red wiggler worms do break things down quicker. There's also the benefit of being able to keep them in a more contained environment so that you're not attracting rodents. So that's the main benefit, in my opinion, for my personal situation, is that I keep my worm bins in trays. And so I keep rodents out. Because I live in the Pacific Northwest, there are rodents in the area. Lots of other people in local neighborhood groups that I'm in complain about having rats around. And I don't. So the main reason that I don't is because I'm careful about how I compost. I do not put any food in the compost rings that are just open to the ground and open to the air because I don't want to attract rodents. So the vermicomposting is quicker, things break down faster, and you also have the benefit of the liquid that is created when the red wiggler worms break food down. The byproduct of that process happening is that there is a liquid that is created. You may have heard it referred to as like worm pee. It's not. Worms don't pee. It's just a liquid that is created as a byproduct of breaking down food and other organic materials. Normally, you don't really have the ability to harvest that liquid because it just goes down into the soil. But if you're using vermicompost bins, you have the ability then to collect that liquid and you can take it around to your plants and use it as a fertilizer. It's a pretty nice fertilizer. I do put it, you need to dilute it. It's pretty strong. It basically should look like weak tea. Like regular tea that maybe you put a lot of ice in and it got watered down Coca-Cola or something like that. That's the look that it should have if you're going to put it on your plants. But you can also take that worm tea, as they call it, the liquid that you collect from your vermicompost bin, and put it on your regular compost piles, and you're basically inoculating it with compounds that will help to accelerate the compost turning into something that you can use in your garden. So there's a couple benefits to doing vermicompost that will help you to get quicker compost turnover with your regular just yard waste compost. The other benefit to the vermicompost bins that I use is that I do have chickens, and so I will also harvest some of those worms and feed them to the chickens. So then I have a protein source, a live protein source that is natural and healthy that they can utilize. Worms are cool in that they are a self-regulating population. The more food that you give them, the more they will increase reproduction. If there are less resources available to them, so you're not feeding them as much, then they just pull back on production. So it's kind of cool because you really can't ever have like too many worms for your setup for however much you're feeding them. If there's not a lot of resources available, then they just don't reproduce as much. And the other thing that goes along with that is if you take some out, feed them to your chickens or your ducks or whatever birds you feed, then they will just increase production so that they can bring their numbers back up. So that's a cool benefit to vermicomposting. And it's really very simple. Like I said, I did order the worms online, but they're not very expensive. And I have some other videos on my TikTok and my YouTube where I talk about how I created my vermicompost system. It's very simple and cost effective. So basically I just used paper trays, like file paper trays that you would see in an office, just flat bins. They're only like about that deep. And I drilled holes in the bottom so liquid can go out of the system. I stacked them up, and it's basically a demonstration of how you can do vermicomposting on a really small scale. So even if you live in an apartment and you only have a balcony, you can still compost worms in a really compact system like that for very little money. There are some really nice vermicompost towers. I kind of call them like a condo, that you can buy on Amazon and other places, and they're great. They're pricey though. So if you would rather just buy something that's already set up for you and get started and you don't care too much about the cost, they're about $100, then that's a really great way to go, because I've had a couple of those in my lifetime and they work great. But if $100 is more than you want to spend to dispose of waste, which I completely understand, then you can create your own. It's very simple. You can use bins, you can use plastic trays, you can use a lot of different things. So if you're curious, check out my other videos on my YouTube channel, on my TikTok channel, where I talk about how I created that system. So the other way that you can compost is with black soldier flies. Now, black soldier flies are not like regular house flies. They don't bite. And they don't swarm around your food because they're mostly eating things that are rotting. And so having black soldier flies around, it can be helpful because they help to break things down, which helps to keep the number of regular flies down because now they're in competition for food. And like I said, black soldier flies don't bite. So that's a huge, huge benefit. Black soldier flies are also more efficient at breaking food down than the vermicompost system that I described, where I have the red wiggler worms. They're very efficient. They can also handle some things that red wiggler worms can't, like they can handle citrus, and that's something you don't want to give to the red wiggler worms. Citrus is too acidic. It changes the pH in a way that is detrimental to your red wiggler worms. So if you have a lot of citrus that you're trying to dispose of, then the black soldier flies are a really good way to go. I have also heard that they can break down meat and bone. However, I put some bone into my black soldier fly farm and I got maggots. And I'm not trying to farm regular house flies. So I won't be doing that again. If you keep a black soldier fly setup in your house, you're probably not going to get maggots. And a lot of people do keep black soldier flies to feed other animals. So I use the larvae to feed my chickens. Some people use them to feed reptiles. And so they have a black soldier fly farm in their house, and they harvest the black soldier flies and or the larvae and feed it to their reptiles. So if you're keeping your setup inside the house, you're probably not going to get maggots unless you have flies in your house. But I keep mine outside. And so I have a thing on top that allows the black soldier flies to get in, but it has a screen on it so rodents can't get in. And so that's how the regular flies also got in. And they laid their eggs there and got maggots. And that's, I mean, it's gross, but also it's just increasing the amount of regular flies that are around, and I'm not interested in doing that. So I don't put meat or bone into my black soldier fly farm any longer. But I do put regular food waste in there. And again, I have a video on my TikTok account about how I set it up. And it's very efficient because I didn't even have to get anything to get started. I noticed that there were black soldier flies around. I know what they look like. And so I noticed that in my garden, there were a couple flying around. So I just created a bin for them. And basically it was like, if you build it, they will come. I created an environment for them to live in, and they moved in and they started reproducing. And then I had black soldier fly larvae that I can harvest and give to my chickens. And black soldier fly larvae, I mean, it's basically mealworms. It's basically the grubbies that you see sold. The main benefit of them for chickens is that, one, they're a protein source. Two, they're a protein source that's high in calcium. And that's good for chickens. They need calcium in order to make their eggshells. So instead of buying freeze-dried grubbies or mealworms is also a great thing to do for your chickens if you don't want to farm your own. Buying those and giving them to the chickens, for one thing, they love them. They'll be really excited and really happy with you. But it's good for them because it's protein, and it's protein that has a lot of calcium. So if you don't want to farm your own, buying them is a great option. Farming your own is a more budget-friendly option. I just used a bin that I already had that, was cracked, and I wasn't going to use to store whatever I had in it before. And I had a few pieces of PVC pipe left over from other projects. And so I just repurposed all of that and made a bin. It was very simple. And if you don't have PVC pipe laying around, it's just a couple of elbows mostly. So if you wanted to buy the materials yourself, you're only talking about a few dollars. So if you're curious about it, if you're curious about doing black soldier flies outside, take a look at my video. I'm very conscientious about setting it up in a way that allows the soldier flies to get in, but not rodents. That's important. Okay, so let's move on from composting. So a couple other myths that I wanted to talk about were about chicken keeping. It's very common that you hear chicken keepers recommend that you don't give onions to your chickens. And there are a couple of reasons. One is a myth and one is maybe true. the first myth is that chickens can't eat onion, that it's unhealthy for them. That is not true. Chickens can definitely eat onion. They can eat the bulb, they can eat the green part, they can eat any part of the plant. It's perfectly fine. So the other part is that sometimes people have found that having their chickens eat onion changed the taste of the egg. I have never found that to be true, but I also don't bake. So I mostly use onion eggs, like in scrambled eggs or in a frittata or other things like that, where if it tastes a little bit like onion, it doesn't bother me, and or I won't notice. I've never noticed a taste change, but I don't bake. So if you're using your eggs for baked goods, a little onion flavor in a cinnamon roll is probably not going to be very complimentary. So if that's a concern for you, maybe don't give your chickens onion. That said, if you made a dish and it didn't all get eaten and it's got a little bit of onion in it, it's perfectly fine to give that to the chickens. It is not harmful to their health. There was even a study done in 2017 that was looking at chicken manure for the purposes of using it as a fertilizer. So what they did in the study, they gave chickens access to an area where onions were being grown, and they wanted to see whether the chicken manure would increase productivity relative to the onion. So the chickens were given access to an area where onions were grown, and so they ate parts of the onion, as chickens do. There were no adverse effects to the chicken's health. The study was looking at whether or not the chicken manure as a fertilizer was effective for helping the onions to grow bigger, faster, both. But the interesting thing for a chicken keeper is that there were no adverse effects to the health of the chickens. So chickens can eat onion, but like I said, if you are using your eggs for baking, maybe you might notice a flavor change if you give them a lot. So maybe don't do that. There's also some studies that have looked at how onions affect geese, and onion can be fatal to geese. So if you have geese, that's also something to think about. I would look more into that before I gave onions to geese, but I don't have geese, so that's not something I'm really well versed on. I just know that there is some concern about that where it comes to geese. And there was a study that was done where they confirmed that. So look into that if you've got geese. So the other myth about chickens that I hear often is that pumpkin seeds are a dewormer. Pumpkin seeds are not dewormers, unfortunately. That would be really nice. So there have been a variety of studies done on using pumpkin seed fiber or a compound that is present in pumpkin seed and extract as a dewormer for a variety of animals, including chickens. None have proved definitively that pumpkin seeds, either in whole form in extract or just the fibrous part, was effective at deworming chickens. So I'm not really sure where that one comes from. It seems like maybe just a wives' tale, or maybe someone read those studies and sort of inferred something. But yeah, it's not a dewormer. That said, chickens really like pumpkin seeds. There's nothing inherently bad about feeding it to them. So, if you've been feeding pumpkin seeds to your chickens all your life and they've never gotten worms, great, keep doing it. Awesome. But correlation isn't necessarily causation. And in this case, there's nothing to support the idea that pumpkin seeds are a dewormer, and studies have been done to try and prove that that is something that can be accomplished either through an extract of a compound that is present in pumpkin seeds, or the fibrous part of pumpkin seeds, or whole pumpkin seeds, and none have really definitively said, yes, it decreases the overall load. So no, not a dewormer, but still a good thing to feed chickens. So another Really common myth about chickens, something that almost everyone wanted to warn me about when I mentioned that I'm getting chickens, is that chickens need heat. Chickens don't need heat. Chickens are birds, and birds live outside. And chickens can live outside without heat. Now, I don't live in an area that gets below 0 very often, although it does happen. So I don't like to misrepresent myself as someone who lives in an area that's absolutely freezing cold. But it does get below freezing where I live. It does get below 0 where I live. And I don't provide any heat for my chickens. And I have never had any adverse effects. I've never even gotten frostbite on any of my chickens' combs or wattles, which is a sign that they have been exposed to a lot of cold, right? Like getting frostbite, it isn't necessarily detrimental to a bird's health, but that would be a sign to me that they are suffering the effects of cold. That's never happened. I've never had a bird die, thankfully, from freezing temperatures. I have a camera in the coop. There's really nothing that they're doing that even makes it seem like they're uncomfortable. When chickens are uncomfortable, they make a lot of noise. And they also will all huddle up together and sleep together if they're really cold. I mean, they huddle up together a little bit anyway. It's just a comfort thing for them. It's just a natural behavior for birds. But if they're cold, they will really pile up together and huddle up for warmth. And I've never observed them doing anything like that, anything different than their normal behavior when it's really cold out. So I don't provide heat for my birds, for one, because they don't need it. And two, because some of the heat sources are potentially problematic. There are like heat plates that you can use that are a little bit less likely to catch fire. They're safer. But my chickens do live outside, and I would have to run an extension cord. And that's just possibly problematic. There are, like I mentioned, if you've been watching since the beginning, there are rodents in the area where I live. And rodents are known for chewing on electrical wires. So I'm not comfortable keeping something in the coop where the birds sleep and are locked in at night that could potentially cause a fire. And the thing that is really a lot more likely to cause a fire than a heat plate is a heat lamp. Those light bulbs get very hot, and it happens every year that someone's chicken coop catches on fire because of a heat lamp, and all of the birds perish. Which is really sad. That's a horrible way for an animal to meet its end. And it's also a loss for you. You just lost your resource. You lost your animals that you may be attached to, or your children may be attached to. And you have to rebuild your coop. I mean, it's devastating to you as a chicken keeper. So that's why I'm not telling anyone else what to do. I'm not in charge of anybody else or what they do. But that's my feeling, is that it's unnecessary and potentially harmful or fatal. So I don't do it. The other common chicken myth, more common with people who have not had chickens or are just still thinking about getting chickens, is you don't need a rooster to get eggs. You do need a rooster to get fertilized eggs. So if you are wanting to hatch out chicks, yes, you need a rooster or buy fertilized eggs. But you do not need a rooster just to get eggs. Chickens have been bred over hundreds of years to produce about 1 egg per day. So most of the breeds that you will find available for purchase for a backyard chicken keeper, like the Rhode Island Reds and lots of others, have been crossbred and selectively bred to produce about 1 egg per day. And they will do that regardless of whether or not there is a rooster around. They their bodies just naturally create that egg, and it needs to get out of their body or they're going to have a serious health problem. So no, you do not need a rooster in order to get eggs. Roosters can have some benefits. They are good protectors for flocks. I don't have a rooster. For one thing, where I live, you're not supposed to have roosters. I did have some accidental roosters when I first got the flock that I have now. We actually had 4 accidental roosters that we had to deal with. So I have had roosters, but I don't keep them intentionally. My best way of protecting my chickens is a predator-proof run. I live in a relatively urban area. My house is on like 1/10 of an acre. I don't have a lot of space. I have neighbors on all sides. I live in a cul-de-sac. I mean, it's very urban. And so I have to contend with all of the natural predators. Like, there are hawks, there are raccoons, there are opossums. Seasonally, sometimes there are bears, but you can't really bear-proof a chicken run. I mean, a bear will get in the house if it really wants it. So, you know, my best way of deterring a bear attack is to make the chickens invisible to a bear and hope that the smell isn't enough to make it rip the door off and eat my chickens. So, but that's only a seasonal problem. Thankfully, knock on wood, I haven't had an issue. But there are raccoons around. I have seen them in my yard. I have seen their droppings in my yard. I have seen possums. They do pass through the yard. Some of my neighbors feed feral cats and their own cats outside, which attracts possums. Possums love cat food. What part of the country am I in? I am in the Pacific Northwest, so I live in Oregon. I live in the Willamette Valley, so I live in Eugene. And so there are lots of predators around here, despite the fact that it is a pretty urban area. There are still there are lots of areas around here that they set aside for like wildlife preservation, which is great. I have no problem with that. It just is something that then I have to take into consideration. Those predators are around. But the main predator that I am worried about is just neighborhood dogs. It used to be my own dog. Unfortunately, my dog passed away a couple months ago. Yes, that is a long way from Kentucky. Yes, it is. But neighborhood dogs are really like my top concern. I have a couple neighbors who have big dogs and they're not the most responsible. I have seen their dogs, running around in the street in the cul-de-sac. So my biggest concern really is dogs. Obviously the raccoons and opossums are big concerns too, because those animals love chicken. Everybody loves chicken. So I have, my chicken coop is elevated off the ground. That just helps to give them access to more area without me having to necessarily give them more square footage. It's elevated off the ground. I have a latch with a carabiner on it because raccoons are smart enough to figure out how to operate a latch. They're very smart animals and they have opposable thumbs. So contending with raccoons is interesting. So I have a latch and a carabiner on the latch. Thankfully, they haven't figured that out. I also have a fully secure run. It is completely wrapped with chicken cloth all the way around the sides. There is chicken cloth skirting the outside of the area and hardware cloth. Sorry if I said chicken wire, that's not what I meant. All hardware cloth and on the top. So I don't use any, you too, thank you, bye Wes. I don't use any chicken wire because raccoons and other animals like them can just rip through chicken wire. Their claws are strong enough to just like tissue paper. So, chicken wire, to me, chicken wire isn't for chickens. Chicken wire will keep chickens out of things, but chicken wire will not keep predators away from your chickens. So my entire chicken run is lined with hardware cloth. It's that fine, sort of fine mesh. It's not really mesh, but it's welded wire. It's a lot stronger, a lot thicker. Unfortunately, it is more costly than chicken wire, but losing birds is pretty expensive. So I just protect them. I just spent the extra money to just protect them. I have a pretty big run for my birds because they have to stay in there all the time. Where I live, my neighbors are just too close. They will jump the fence. They can fly. Chickens can fly. That's another common myth about chickens, that they can't fly. Chickens can fly. They're not migratory. They don't fly long distances, but they can absolutely get up in the air. They can get up in a tree. They can get up over a fence. They have feathers and they are effective. So they're not allowed to free range, unfortunately. Where I live, it's just not an option. So they have a pretty big run so that they have plenty of space. And I bring a lot of things into them. Like, that's my strategy for making up for the fact that they don't get to free range. When I mow the lawn, all of the clippings go into the chicken run. When I pull weeds, everything that I pull goes into the chicken run. When I rake up leaves every year in the autumn when they fall, I toss a bunch of them into the chicken run, and they think that that is the greatest thing ever. They get to scratching around, eating the bugs, eating the seeds, doing a great job of breaking the leaves down. And typically what I do, because I don't use my yard waste bin for yard waste, I will store a bunch of leaves in my yard waste bin. So then throughout the winter, I have more leaves so that I can throw into the run for them to scratch around in. And it's great entertainment for them. It's enriching. It's encouraging their natural behavior. But also, it does a great job of keeping the mud down. So my chicken run doesn't really get muddy with like sticky, cakey mud because the leaves, and I also put straw in there when I clean out the chicken coop. And as they scratch those things into the ground, it does a great job of just mixing in with the mud so that it doesn't get like sticky and cakey. So yeah, I wanted to clarify, when I clean out my chicken coop, the chicken coop setup is very simple. There is a roosting bar, there is 3 nest boxes, and that's basically it. There's not a lot in there. It's very simple. And so toward the back is where the roosting bar is, and then in the front is where the nest boxes are. So the nesting boxes, I change out the straw that's in there just to keep things clean and refreshed, mite free, all of that sort of stuff. But it's not really dirty because they don't spend a lot of time in there. They don't sleep in there. They don't roost over it. So there's not, I mean, sometimes there are some droppings in there because as they lay eggs, sometimes their droppings come out too. But it's relatively clean. So when I take it out, I throw it into the run. And then they get to work immediately scratching through it all, having an awesome time, tearing it all apart, breaking it down, turning it into compost, and mixing it with the earth underneath so that, as I mentioned, it doesn't get muddy in there. And then the rest that is more soiled because it's under the roosting bar where they sleep at night, that I take out and I put into my compost ring, and I leave it there for several months, at least 3 months. 90 days is what is recommended by the universities who have studied pathogens and how to kill those pathogens or wait for those pathogens to die. There's 2 ways of doing that. One is the hot compost method that's pretty effective for killing the pathogens, and that you can accomplish in about 30 days. The other is 90 days, and that's a cold compost method where basically like you just set it and forget it. You just set your manure mixed with whatever bedding you're using aside and just let it be exposed to the elements for 90 days, and those pathogens will die. So Whatever method you use is perfectly fine. I typically use the cold compost method because I'm too lazy to turn my compost pile over. And there's no rush. I always have a compost ring going. So I don't need to turn it over quickly. So I don't. I devote my attention to other things that need my attention. So if you're curious about that, like how to utilize the compost, the manure as compost, what you want to do is either hot compost for 30 days or cold compost for 90 days. And you can look that up there are a variety of universities that have studied the pathogens that are present in animal manure and chicken manure. And they'll tell you exactly how long you should wait. So don't take my word for it. Look it up and make sure that, keep me honest. But I researched it, and so that's my strategy. And I am all about using all of the resources that I have access to in ways that save me money. So all of the chicken manure and bedding that the chickens produce, or that I bring in for the chickens, is all used somewhere. I don't throw any of it away. There are very few things that I throw away other than things like styrofoam that you just can't compost. Everything that comes in, including boxes, as long as they aren't printed with like colored or glossy ink, and junk mail, all of those things go into my compost systems. Most of the junk mail that I get, I have a home office shredder. I shred them, and that goes into the worm bins. The boxes go into the compost rings that I have. They're a great brown material. They do a great job of breaking down. I also use boxes a lot for weed suppression. Every year I have like a border around my grassy area where I have raised beds where I grow food. And I can't get the mower in between, and I don't like to get in there with a weed eater. It's just too much work. So I will put boxes down in the fall when all the leaves start falling. I put several layers of big boxes, and then I cover that all up with the leaves, and that suppresses the weeds. It does a pretty good job of suppressing the weeds even throughout summer. And then the next year when the leaves start falling again, I repeat the process. So, and I don't really have to pull anything back. You can definitely take that material after it's been sitting there for a year. It's pretty well composted at that point. You can pull that back and then go and add it to your beds, your raised beds, whatever you're growing in, to add more organic matter for what has broken down. So when you have a raised bed, you might notice over time, it seems like the soil is like going somewhere. And it sort of is. I mean, some of it blows off from the wind. Some of it is washed out by rain. But some of it just breaks down. And as it breaks down, it just decreases in volume. So rather than going out and buying more composted manure or composted organic compost or whatever from the garden center, I just take things from around my property, let them break down in my compost ring, or I take that organic matter, that boxes and leaves that I put around my property. Once it's been sitting there for a year, it's pretty well broken down. So I pull that up, put it into my beds. I'm doing that usually in the fall. And so if it's not fully broken down, it's going to sit there for a few more months because I don't really grow anything over winter. There are things you can grow over winter, but I really don't. So it's going to sit there and break down even more. So like I said, I'm all about saving money. I'm all about doing this in a way that is cost effective, that is helping to divert waste from the landfill and use it in a way that actually will benefit me and that is not detrimental to the overall environment. I do think that's important. And if nothing else, I do like saving money. So, any of those things that come into my house, into my possession, I try to find a use for them. And so using the cardboard as a weed suppressant works really well. I have heard some people voice concerns about that, like smothering worms underneath, compacting the soil. When I have gone in and pulled the boxes back that I covered with leaves to use as a weed suppressant, there are two things that I frequently find underneath. Well, a few. The main one that always freaks me out is I find a lot of garden snakes under there. And I'm not like afraid of snakes, but I'm just not expecting them. Every time I see them, they startle me. I'm fine with garden snakes. I love that I have created an environment for them to mate and to survive the winter and to make babies, because there are a lot of benefits to having garden snakes in your garden, but they still startle me. So I find snakes, and two, I find worms. I find earthworms and red wiggler worms that made their way out of my bins underneath the boxes. So it is not causing a detrimental harm to the land. It's not compacting the soil. If anything, I find the opposite to be true. It creates an environment where things like garden snakes can make a home for themselves, make a bed, make a place to make babies, which is good. So anyway, I use the boxes as a weed suppressant. I don't like garden cloth. I don't like that like mesh black cloth stuff that you can buy. Most of the very budget-friendly hardware cloth, black cloth that you can buy at garden centers are woven plastic material. And I really don't like adding more plastic to the environment. There are other things that you can buy that are made of natural materials, but those are more expensive, and sometimes they're even harder to find because people don't buy them at the same frequency. So garden centers stock the things that sell, and the things that sell are the most budget friendly, and the most budget friendly are the worst for the environment. So fortunately, there is another option which is even more budget friendly, which is just using boxes that I already have. And I volunteer at a local food rescue, so they get a lot of boxes, more than they need. And so while I'm there, I'll just take some home, and then I have more than enough boxes to create really thick layers of boxes in the fall. And I love doing it. I love being outside, and I love doing things. So to me, putting the boxes down and covering them with leaves, it's just one of those like sort of mindless, just stress relieving, relaxing, happy place things to do. I love the cool weather. I love autumn leaves. And so I find that activity to be a good thing to do, both for the environment and like my own stress level. So I think that's all of the myths that I wanted to talk about, and there are probably more. So if you have heard other things that you're unsure about, you could go ahead and ask in the comments. I am going to download this after the live is over, and I will put it on my YouTube channel. If you don't subscribe to my YouTube, it is Autumn Farms, so it's very easy to find. I also have a link tree in my TikTok account if you go to my profile, and that will show you all of the different accounts all the social media accounts and my website. So if you're not able to find it on YouTube, you forget what I called my YouTube channel, you can always find the link in my link tree. And if you have other questions about myths or any of the things that I have talked about here, feel free to put them in there, and I will happily answer them for you if I can. If I don't know the answer, I'll just tell you I don't know the answer to that question. So thank you for joining my live today. I really appreciate anyone who came and asked questions, and I will see you next time. Have a great weekend.